Thanks for tuning in to the ATRL Charts podcast. Before we get started, I'd like to give a shout out to Chart Data. You're probably already aware of the excellent Chart Data Twitter account. Its ceaseless, timely updates have been cited by countless artists, managers, and media outlets. Now, the operator of the account is launching a full-fledged website, featuring contributions from myself. The website contains more in-depth updates and statistics than the Twitter account does, and it also hosts all-time leaderboards and other fun chart miscellany. Check out the website at chartdata.org and never miss another milestone. That's chartdata.org.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 18 of the ATRL Charts podcast. As always, my name's Alexander, and I'm here with my co-host, Aaron.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's Aaron, Mitch from ATRL. We're back. Some really good stuff to talk about today, obviously, with all of the hype that's been going on this week. So let's just jump right into it.
All right, well, the first thing, before we get to this week's chart, let's talk about last week's chart. We had, of course, Travis Scott blocking Nicki Minaj in a highly contested race. Travis Scott did 205,000 units second week with Astroworld. That was a 62% drop overall, slightly better than what I was projecting him for on the last podcast. And Nicki Minaj only did 185,000 units, despite her insistence that she was doing above 200,000 all week. Both of them did approximately the same pure sales numbers, around 78,000. That was despite both of them still doing merch bundles, really heavily. Travis Scott doing a lot of merch bundles in his second week, and Nicki Minaj just a slew of them during her first week. Travis Scott outstreamed her by around 40 million streams, and Nicki Minaj, after she lost, went on a head-scratching Twitter tirade in which she pretty much blamed everyone but herself for the number 2 album, including Drake and Spotify and a bunch of really people that seem to come out of left field. So what's your reaction to all of this, to Travis holding on, to Nicki Minaj's meltdown? What do you think it says?
I wasn't shocked a lot. I think the only shocking thing to me was the fact that after everything was said and done, it was just the reaction to how everything was handled by obviously Nicki Minaj and her Twitter rant. But speaking from a charts perspective, I think it obviously came down to the wire once we saw the first set of predictions come out from his Daily Double that she was trailing Travis Scott. Then she added Fifi to the album midweek through the album's release week, and that obviously bumped up her SPS numbers, which is basically the sales equivalent of tracks and the sales equivalent of the streams. And that got her up, but then she also made the album for $5 on her website for about 48 hours, basically 2 days before the end of the tracking week. And with all of that said and done, she still fell short. Now, on Travis Scott's end, he also added more merchandise bundles to his album during Nicki's release week, and he also did more, I think, more tour bundles as well. So, it was just kind of like a wow moment from both sides of the spectrum. Travis Scott had already gotten his number 1 album the week before, so it was just kind of interesting to see why Travis Scott would fight so hard to keep an album at the top for a second week. And that could be politics with the label. Travis Scott is signed to a different label than Nicki Minaj, so then you have that level of competition, because I feel like if they were signed to the same label, those tactics would not have happened. They would have allowed Nicki to get the number 1 album. But again, she's fallen short. Her last album also debuted at number 2. I want to say it was behind Taylor Swift's 1989, which was a monster seller back in 2014. So she went on a tirade. She, again, like you said, she blamed Spotify for not promoting her. She blamed Travis Scott for tactics, which to me was kind of hypocritical, because she did some of the same tactics that Travis Scott also did. So it's kind of like wait, what are you talking about, Nicki Minaj? You also had merchandise bundles, and you also bundled clothes with albums with your sales. So what did Travis Scott do that was different from you? And then she also blamed just a number of people, and then she just kind of just spilling over and spilling over. And it's at the end of the day, you know, it all boiled down to who had the better marketing scheme that week. Obviously, you know, Travis Scott and his label did what they had to do to keep the number one album. Nicki did everything that she could do and still fell short by almost, I want to say, I'm not sure what the exact number was, but she still fell short. Um, and now she just has to settle for a number two album unless something magically happens in the future and she does go number one, but I don't see that really happening these days. But honestly, it just kind of boils down to who did it better. And Travis Scott did it better that week. But again, it kind of, speaking from both terms, I think it kind of played of desperation on his end, desperation on her end, and it just didn't really look too good at the end because we always talk about things that happen with charts like on ATRL, but these things kind of boiled out outside of ATRL because even news outlets had picked up on this, and then some celebrities had picked up on this as well, and then there were shots being thrown at the MTV Video Music Awards about her not getting a number one album. So these things kind of went outside of Stan world, if you will, and kind of got talked about around various outlets. Like I said, in the media, and in most recent cases, the MTV Video Music Awards. So it's kind of they're seeing what we saw and what actually played out. So I think it was just kind of like who had the better marketing scheme. Obviously, Travis did, but in turn, they both kind of got desperate as the week went on.
Yeah, and it really reminded me of a couple of album races last summer that were really competitive. The one where DJ Khaled barely pulled out a victory over Imagine Dragons, and during that week, Imagine Dragons were really trying to drive website sales, and DJ Khaled was using free title streams legitimately, maybe not. And then the race with Lana Del Rey and Meek Mill and Tyler the Creator that week, when Meek Mill also took advantage of title, and I believe that there were a lot of tactics used during those weeks as well. So this isn't anything new, but it was the first time we've really seen merchandise bundles play such a big role. And segueing into this week, I mean, Ariana Grande also used merchandise bundles, and that's part of the reason why her pure sales were so high. She did 125,000 pure sales this week, and undoubtedly helped because of merch bundles. Now, it remains to be seen if every major release is going to have these from now on, but Travis Scott seems to really have woken everybody up to their potential.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be more popular as the weeks go on, as album cycles go on. And to be honest with you, I didn't even know that was a thing until he started doing it because I knew about tour bundles where you buy a ticket and you redeem the album at a later date. But then I didn't know about these merchandise bundles until we had talked about it on our podcast a couple weeks ago. So now it's like, oh, labels are going to see, oh my God, this works. Let's see if we can actually, do some of that with some of our, future artists. So, we have major releases coming up. We still have Rihanna that's going to be releasing, Adele maybe releasing probably sometime next year. We're not exactly sure. So, we're going to watch and see if these next artists or these major artists are going to pull the same type of marketing marketing schemes, if you will, for their next projects.
And I think it's really great for artists. I mean, so far it's only been used by really big artists that have not only fan base support, but to an extent general public support as well. But I really think merch bundles could be great for artists who really don't have mainstream hits, but do have large fan bases, in the same way that ticket bundles are. You talk about rock bands and alternative bands doing ticket bundles. These are bands that have never had hits in the Hot 100, but are still debuting at number one in the Billboard 200 because of the ticket bundles. I think merch bundles, could have the same effect for artists like that. You talk about somebody like Lana Del Rey, who really doesn't have a lot of Hot 100 hits, but has a dedicated fan base. She's a prime candidate for merchandise bundles because when you've got a dedicated fan base that's willing to buy stuff like that, you are now able with merch bundles to leverage that and get you a much higher debut on the Billboard 200 than you would have without that. And this is pertinent because I'm looking this week at BTS. Of course, BTS is one of the most rabid fan bases you'll ever see. I mean, K-pop, that's kind of the par for the course there, but when you compare it to American artists, it's really a rabid fan base, and if you have merchandise bundles, I'm not sure they do, but in the future maybe that would just I would think that would give them a massive first week. And so it has different potential for different artists. For rappers who really rely more on the general public and less on specific fan bases for support, I would think that it wouldn't matter as much. But for artists with, maybe niche artists who are, established but they don't have hits, but they do have fan bases, it's perfect for them.
That's very true. That's very true because they're gonna do everything they need to get their favorite artists up the charts as much as possible. Like you just mentioned with BTS, they do everything in their power to make sure that they're number one on every chart, every streaming chart, every sales chart. So that's a very good example that you mentioned with artists who have very large fan bases and not really supported by the general public. And then, I think this would have been a great example also for One Direction when they were very huge a few years ago. Um, if they would have done merchandise bundles, I feel like they would have sold even more their first weeks. I mean, they already had massive first weeks as they were, but with merchandise bundles, I think they probably would have really done super huge numbers back in the day when they were when they were a band and when they were very basically at the top. So I just want to figure out who's going to be the next artist to do it. If it's going to be a major artist like we said, Rihanna, Adele, even Taylor Swift, or another artist who has a large fan base like Lana Del Rey, if she'll take advantage of that, or if even like someone who's not either who doesn't really get a lot of support from either the from the general public or has a large fan base. It's like sometimes labels can even do research to see how much they could really discount maybe their merchandise to get the album sales, I guess, off the ground. So that'll be interesting to watch as well.
It will be interesting to watch. And right now, though, the big news is Ariana Grande. And I promised that we would get to her pretty early, and we're doing so now. Ariana Grande debuted with 232,000 units first week for Sweetener, according to Hits Daily Double. Of course, today's Saturday. We're recording this on Saturday, so the official Billboard number will come out tomorrow. But the HDD number is 232,000, which would be the biggest debut of her career. 125,000 of those, as I said, pure sales. 95,000 streaming equivalent albums. This is, I would argue, a pretty sizable overperformance. I was thinking she would do in the 160, 170,000 range. So I would call this a pretty sizable overperformance. The singles have been doing pretty well on streaming, especially God is a Woman. We've seen a strong performance from Apple Music. At one point, the album had, I think, a majority of its tracks inside the Apple Music Top 50, which is pretty unheard of for a pop album. So what's your reaction to these first week numbers?
Honestly, I'm very, very surprised. I think we talked about Ariana Grande in a few podcasts ago, and I honestly did not think she would overperform like this. Honestly, I didn't think she would crack 200,000. To be honest, her album sales are very respectable, considering again we're in 2018 and sales are dead. And even with the streaming numbers, she outperformed all of that. And I think someone posted she has the largest female streaming week or first week album. I think she has the largest first week streams for an album. I think surpassing Cardi B earlier this year. So that's pretty good. And we already know how huge invasion of privacy is. Um, so I'm very surprised, and I bow down to Ariana Grande's numbers. She really, really did her thing. Um, the singles haven't been as strong as a start as with when she had a string of singles a couple years ago, or actually 4 years ago, with Problem, Break Free, Bang Bang, all through the summer of 2014. So she hasn't had those type of hits with this go around. And even last year with Dangerous Woman, I mean, Dangerous Woman was a pretty sizable moderate hit as well. It peaked at number 8, I believe, but it kind of stayed in the top 20 for quite some time. And Into You was a top 20 hit as well, but it also did not go top 10. So even this time around, No Tears Left to Cry was a sizable hit, stayed in the top 10, top 15 pretty much all of its life. and now God is a Woman is out and debuted at 11, but kind of dropped and kind of making his way back up, and actually probably has a chance to go even higher after the performance, which spiked the sales and streams considerably this week, and coupled with the album being released. So that also helps. But I think that we kind of talked about this in a podcast or two ago, where is pop really dead? There are people really switching gears from, you know, are they really switching gears from pop to just completely being dominated by the hip hop and urban trend? I think Ariana Grande's album and recent success is at least not a full answer of no or yes, because I feel like there is still a chance for female pop albums to do great. And then, as you just mentioned, she had pretty much her whole album within the top 50 of Apple Music. I mean, not to mention Spotify, but with Apple Music, which is, as we know, heavily urban and hip hop dominated with tracks. And to see pop album or to see pop tracks do very well on Apple Music in this day and age is pretty telling. So I do think that with that success, I don't think that the future of female pop is completely dead. I just think that it's going to take some time for it to kind of build its way back up. And I do think that Ariana Grande her recent success really shows that there is chance for even like the girls who are currently out, like your Camilas and your Selena Gomez, your Demi Lovato's, and like even like the more recent, or I guess if you want to call them veteran pop girls, um, there's still chances for success. So I don't think it's completely dead. It's just like Ariana Grande just completely overperformed, I think, a lot of people's expectations, and even like her own fan base, because I think that a lot of predictions did not take this over 150 or even the 175 mark for total units, and she's done way more than that. So this album is definitely going to go platinum. So that's I mean that's a no-brainer. So it's just going to see how this album holds up in the long run, but I do think that it's going to have some long-term success.
Yeah, and talking about that weekly Spotify record, which I believe that is true, that she does now have the record for the largest first week for a female artist on US Spotify. A couple of caveats there. The first thing is that Invasion of Privacy was one of the most Apple Music fueled albums released this year. I think only around 30 something percent. I said the exact number on a past episode, but around 30 something percent of its streams came from Apple Music, Spotify first week. And so I doubt that Sweetener will outstream Invasion of Privacy in the end, although that's partly a function of the fact that Invasion of Privacy has a couple massive hits on it. But I agree with you that it's a rebuke to the pop is dead and people are only listening to urban now. No, clearly there are some artists, some names in pop that can draw listeners not just from a fan base, but from the general public. If you look at all of the pop girl hits recently over the last 6 months to a year, you think about it, they've mostly been radio fueled. And that's no surprise, that's no coincidence. You think about songs like Delicate that are pretty much almost completely radio fueled, and you see the trend that, okay, pop girls aren't streaming at all, but radio's still playing them because they're the establishment favorites. With Ariana, that's not quite the case, because even though No Tears Left to Cry was still a radio fueled hit, it didn't flop on streaming. It posted fine numbers for most of its run, and even good numbers for its first couple of weeks. What you're seeing is the power of her star. I know that's a cliche thing to say, but clearly she draws people, whether it's via her name or via the people that she's working with. Like, for example, she worked with Pharrell. She worked in conjunction with Pharrell a lot for this latest album, and you have to wonder if that drew listeners in. She has a draw to her, an appeal to her that extends beyond, a stan base on Twitter or small communities on ATRL or anything like that. So it's very impressive to see. And talking about, the singles coming in advance, that's the most impressive part of this to me, is that she got this week without having any massive hits, without even having a singles run as strong as she did in 2014. In fact, it's very comparable to Dangerous Woman, what you talked about, because Dangerous Woman peaked in the lower parts of the top 10, had pretty decent longevity, was pretty big on pop radio, and a little bit smaller than that on streaming. That's pretty much exactly what No Tears Left to Cry was, even though you could argue that No Tears Left to Cry was probably a bigger hit in the end. But a very similar lead-up situation, and she added 50,000. So, or 60,000. I don't know. I think Dangerous Woman did 175, so 232. That would be adding almost 60,000. So you have pretty much the same scenario, but you're adding 60,000 units. I think that's great any way you spin it.
Yeah, it's great all around. I mean, there's no bad thing to say about those numbers. She promoted. She does what an artist is supposed to do, is promote. The promotion helped. Breathing topped iTunes. God is Woman also topped iTunes a day or two after the VMAs, and it's doing well on streaming. And I think it just spells good news for this era, for the Sweetener era. After listening to parts of the album, I do think there are single worthy tracks from the album that can carry the album to, for longevity. And I know I talked about it in a couple podcasts ago that I didn't really see that much longevity for the album, but now again, I've changed my mind after seeing what's happened and seeing what she's offered on the album. So I do think that she will be fine, and I don't think pop music is completely over. I do think that it's going through a low phase right now in terms of visibility, but I do think there will be a new wave of pop trends and even like new faces of pop music from male artists and from female artists that will make it, I hate to say this word, but that will make it popular again, basically.
And I want to talk about Breathing for a little bit because that's another interesting case because it's essentially a single now. It's the de facto single now. I'm not sure if it actually has an ad date, but it basically, I think everybody knows that it's going to be a single at this point. It wasn't, I mean, it was essentially one of those that was chosen by the public, where it essentially, was the highest charting album track on Spotify and Apple Music, and stayed that way. And when you do that, if you have one song on an album that does that, stays ahead of the rest of the pack for long enough on streaming, that's going to eventually become the single. Again, we saw this with Mask Off by Future, we saw this with Bank Account by 21 Savage. Songs that are just normal album tracks when the album gets released quickly become elevated to single status because they perform so much better than the rest of the tracks. And I think that's very exciting because labels can no longer precisely dictate what songs are going to be singles post-album release. Sure, you can put out a song as a lead single and say, okay, this is the lead single. But once the album is released, all bets are off. The public chooses. Remember, Future's label originally wanted him to have the song Draco as the next single off of the album Future. But the public ended up choosing Mask Off, and so the label, relented and decided to push Mask Off to radio. It's really this democratization of the single choosing process that we see now. And this is the first time that I can recall it happening with a pop artist as opposed to a rap artist, because typically pop artists aren't strong enough in streaming to have one song that's so far ahead of the rest on the album. Typically, most pop artists will just have the single high up and all of the album tracks clustered near the bottom. So this is interesting to see it happening with a pop artist for the first time.
Yeah, I noticed that too, and I think that was a track that was promoted on iTunes and the track that got, I think, the number one spot on today's top hits on Spotify. So again, that's just a testament as to how well received the single is, and that again, like you said, is probably going to be the next single from the album once God is a Woman has finished doing its thing. And I do think there was like some small airplay that it got during its release week. I'm not sure how much exactly, but that's also a sign of curiosity and to see if it's going to test well with pop radio. But yeah, I do think at the end of the day, you are completely right. Like, what happens during release week and what you see that's very popular during that time frame will determine what the singles are going to be and how the era is going to go. So, when you have an era like Sweetener, where you have Breathing being the standout track, when you have Breathing being the standout track during release week, then it's kind of signals to Ariana and her label was like, all right, so this tested well, we're gonna go with it, and this is kind of what we're gonna have to do because as you've seen in the past, and as we've talked about prior or in previous podcasts, when you try to release a single that hasn't been tested well with the audience at all and kind of just throwing it out there, it's it's really a 50-50 chance. It's either going to do well or it's not. Um, and when you wait later on in the album cycle, maybe months or even a year later, again, we talked about this as well, streaming fatigue sets in. So something that you may want to release a year from now may not do well on Spotify at all unless you have a very, very high replay value video that could pick up the streams. But in terms of on demand streams, the streams are going to be fatigued. So, again, it's best to know your audience now and focus on, releasing those singles that are very popular, right after right after the current single is done or right after the album release is over. So like the week after, like, In My Feelings was pretty much the single right after, right after the release week, and once it went viral, that was pretty much a clear sign that it needed to be a single. Mask Off, the same thing. Um, Also with obviously Travis Scott, Sicko Mode. Look at that. They're still sticking around. And Billboard actually posted an article about a day or two ago, posting possible songs that could become number one in the future. And they listed Sicko Mode as one of those songs, which personally I don't see. But we've seen crazier things, so anything can happen. But Sicko Mode is sticking around and it's doing pretty well. And obviously that was the track that got the most popularity during the album release week, and that's the song that they're going with and promoting at the current time. So that's kind of a trend that we've been seeing, and a trend that labels may want to pick up with as well if they want to have a moderately successful era.
And I'm sure we'll check in on Breathe In as it as its chart run continues, and we'll check. We'll actually talk about Sicko Mode a little bit later too when we talk about potential future number ones. But right now, let's pivot to our segment. Will it go top 10? We are doing this segment once again. We had a couple of suggestions for the segment sent in, and we will cover them. As a reminder, if you have not heard us do the segment before, which is unlikely if you're a listener of the podcast because we do it most of our podcasts, essentially we're just looking at several songs that are rising on the Hot 100 right now but are not top 10. We're evaluating their chances of going top 10. And the first song that we'll start with is 5 Seconds of Summer's Youngblood. Do you think this song has the potential to go top 10?
Oh yes, I think the chances are pretty high with this one. Um, this is a song that, in my surprise, came out of nowhere. Um, 5 Seconds of Summer are not known for hits. To be quite honest, they're known mainly for their album sales their first weeks because they have large fan base. So their albums do well in that aspect, but then they haven't had any singles that have really taken off to this extent. So it's just a testament that the general public is taking notice of Young Blood and they are doing really well. And as of this posting, they are in the top 10 on pop radio actually with a nice sized bullet. With actually gained 217 spins today on pop radio, and it still has a lot of room to grow in that department. And I do think it has a very nice shot at going top 10. It's doing really well at iTunes, it's doing really well at radio. I think it's doing okay-ish at streaming, but we've seen songs that have still hit the top 10 with just those same type of conditions. So I think they do have a really good shot, and I'll put that like at least 70 to 80% chance of going top 10.
And it doesn't really matter how well it is doing on streaming if it ends up going number one on pop radio. Unless it's truly flopping on streaming like Delicate. But it's number 28 on Spotify, which is pretty good. It's top 50 on YouTube, number 47 on YouTube, which is really not bad for the kind of song that it is. It's not charting on Apple Music, but once again, most pop songs get most of their streams from Spotify, so I wouldn't be alarmed by the fact that it's not charting on Apple Music. It's number 17 on the Hot 100 right now, so it's already, eight ninths of the way there. and it's really rising well on radio, as you said. It's number 16 on overall radio with around 63.7 million audience impressions, and it's number 7 on pop with a bullet of over 1,000. So it's really rising well. This is their first truly massive pop radio hit in the making, I think. I've heard it a lot on radio lately. The listeners seem to, I think it gets pretty good call out scores, and I would say that it has at least, I would put it at 60 or 70% at least as well, because I think that its momentum on radio is not going to stop, and so far it's shown pretty good stability on Spotify. It was actually up in the top 20 when it first came out for a couple of days, I believe, but it really hasn't fallen that far. There have been some songs where after they've been released and started to climb radio have really started to fall on Spotify and ended up with really, you know, with peaks that are very far from each other. A pop radio peak that occurred months after its streaming peak. A song like New Rules, for example, by Dua Lipa, peaked on Spotify many, many months before it peaked on radio. On Youngblood, we're not seeing as much of a disparity. It's still pretty high on Spotify, and so I'm encouraged by that in terms of its prospects for going top 10. So I would put it at 60-70. You're saying 70-80, so I think we're in agreement that this song is more likely than not to go top 10, especially with the fact that competition is fairly weak right now. We've got a weakening number 1. We don't have any major album releases on the horizon like we did pretty much constantly for the last few months. Post Malone, J. Cole, Drake, blah, 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 blah. We had so many, but now we seem to be entering a little bit of a quiet stretch before the start of quarter 4, and I think that should allow Youngblood to sneak in.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think they have a really good chance considering again the momentum is in their favor. They don't have, again, like you said, a lot of competition. The doesn't seem to be slowing down at all at pop radio, especially with this type of acceleration. You're just not going to see the song drop like a rock in the next week, considering that there's still a lot of songs above it that have to peak. And we've seen this trend where, radio will allow songs to, I guess, creep up as songs are falling down from the top at pop radio. And then again, it has, sales are doing really, really well. And, for a song like this. So I think they have the momentum definitely in their favor.
All right, so the next song that we're going to talk about is East Side, which is a collaboration between the producer and songwriter Benny Blanco, Halsey, and Khalid. And this is a fairly new song. It's only been on the Hot 100 for 5 weeks. It's number 48 right now, and it's number 16 on Spotify. Actually reached the top 10 for a couple of days over the last few weeks. And it's charting at number 61 on Apple Music and number 58 on YouTube. So one would think that this might be another Spotify and radio-driven hit. Halsey and Khalid have both seen a lot of success on pop radio over the last year or so. Khalid also on rhythmic radio. This song is like a kind of a dance hall influenced pop song. What do you think of its chances of going top 10?
I think the chances are kind of low to medium. Honestly, I don't really see it taking off as much. I mean, we've seen crazier things. I mean, I didn't expect Love Lies to become as huge as it is now. I mean, it came out in February of this year, and now we're heading in September, and it's knocking on the top 10's door as we speak. It just peaked at number 11. So, I mean, I don't think anybody predicted that way back when. But I think for this song, it's kind of, it is a very unique collaboration in that sense. So I think, you have a lot of, maybe new fans who may be discovering the song on radio or, on music, music videos and whatnot on television. But I don't know. I just think that the song really doesn't have a lot of momentum going forward. Maybe after, fall starts, it's just, I don't know. There's something maybe missing in terms of like maybe lack of performances or something like that, like some type of visibility, because I don't think they've actually performed this song live, which probably won't even happen because we don't really see a lot of songs being helped out by promotion a lot these days. But I would say the chances are maybe like 30 to 40% right now, considering that it is still kind of early on in its chart run. I think you mentioned it's only been on the chart for about 5 weeks. So there's still a lot of maybe potential momentum that can occur within the next couple months. But I mean, personally, I don't see it. So that's why I kind of rank it low in terms of probability of going top 10. You do have Halsey and Khalid who are, I guess, on the vocals. And a lot of people don't know who Benny Blanco is. I mean, a lot of people who know about songwriting and song productions may know him, but as an artist, a lot of people don't know him well. So I think in that sense, it's going to take off pretty slow. And if it does gain some momentum, maybe later this year, maybe like October or something around that time frame. But like I said, I would put it at a 30-40% chance.
Yeah, and although its streaming is stronger than that of Youngblood's, especially the Apple Music placement, it's number 61 on Apple Music, and Youngblood isn't top 200. It does have a ways to go on pop radio, and before you get, I mean, unless you're already inside the top 10, there's really a chance that you can crash and burn on pop radio at any time. Although I'm not sure how likely it is, considering how Benny Blanco to those in radio circles is probably a pretty established name by now. And Halsey, of course, has had great pop radio success. Now or Never, Bad at Love, both big pop radio hits. Even Alone, which was released over the winter, this winter spring, which didn't do anything anywhere else, still went top 40, top 30 on pop radio, I believe. So Halsey's really got her foot in the door on pop radio. And Khalid also has had a lot of success. Young, Dumb, and Broke really was a sleeper on pop radio, even though it wasn't strong on streaming by the time it peaked on pop. And it's interesting because Khalid started as like a SoundCloud-like breakout. Location was never meant Location was not a radio song initially. It blew up on streaming, and then it transitioned to radio. But Khalid really made a seamless transition. I don't know if it's his radio promo team that did an amazing job, or maybe he's just really likable, but he really made a great transition to radio. They really like him now. And looking on Spotify, Eastside is number 3 on today's top hits, which is a really high placement. So it's probably gonna stay pretty stable on Spotify at least for the next couple of weeks to the next 3-4 weeks, the next month or so because of that placement. Even one placement on such a high profile placement, when you've got when on such a high profile playlist, even one placement that high makes a big difference. So I'm confident in it being fairly big in the end. I'm not sure if it's going to be able to muster up a top 10 peak, but I do think that in the end it'll be at least a sizable, moderate hit. I think that it would need probably rhythmic radio support or better support from YouTube to get to the top 10, which I'm not sure it's going to get either of those because the video is already out, and I can't think of any other boost that it would be able to get. Remix would be kind of awkward because there are already 2 artists featured in the song, and any boost on Spotify seems difficult because it's already very high on today's top hits, and I'm sure that because of that, it's probably high on a bunch of other playlists as well. So if I had to bet, I would guess that this peaks in late October, November or so, and it peaks in the 15-20 range. So I would say around a 20% chance, 30% chance of going top 10. That doesn't mean it won't be a decently sized hit, though.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, obviously, if it misses the top 10, I think it'll still be a very moderate size hit at the end. I mean, like you said, it's very promoted at Spotify, and that's going to keep its momentum going on the Hot 100 for a while, and it's still rising on radio. So it's not to say that radio is, dropping it. It's not being really receptive to it now as it could be, since they have 2 names on the track that have seen success at pop radio lately. But again, it's not taken off in the fashion that you would think it would for those 2 names. But I do think that it will continue to rise on the Hot 100 and be definitely a top 40 hit. But top 10, not really sure, low chances, but definitely a moderate size top 20 to top 20 to top 30 hit.
Alright, so let's pivot back to Ariana Grande and talk about God is a Woman. This has really been one of the most talked about songs and videos over the last couple of weeks. It debuted at number 11, as you alluded to earlier, and it's now at number 30 in its 5th week on the chart, same week as Eastside, and it's rising up again, as you said. Very, very strong on-demand streaming performance, which is helping that out, and it's rising very quickly on pop radio. It's number 15 on pop with a bullet over 1,400, 35 million audience impressions just from pop. It's number 7 on Spotify, still top 10 on Apple Music, and number 30 on YouTube. Is it going to eventually outpeak itself and go top 10?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty like much a given that it's gonna go top 10. I mean, we won't say anything as a given yet because things happen. um, but I mean, definitely like a 90% chance, given the fact that it did so well this week on streaming, and it did so well this week in sales, and she also performed that same track at the Video Music Awards, and I think she got one of the largest. Boost in consumption and well actually in sales after the VMAs. So she has that going in her favor. But it's definitely going to go past his number 11 peak and peak in the top 10. Now to say where in the top 10, that's also kind of a complex question because now that the song has officially kind of taken off in Ariana fashion, now it's just to see how it's going to fare once, if and when it does go into the top 10. Now it's starting to get those radio updates that I would have expected when the song came out about a month ago, or whenever. I think the song came out about a month ago. I was expecting huge updates on radio back then, but now we're starting to see those, and now it seems that No Tears Left to Cry is kind of fizzling out and kind of trying to weasel his way out of being, heavily played on radio, and now we can finally see God as a Woman start to shine there. Where obviously we know Ariana is pretty much a radio staple, at least a pop radio staple at this point. So I think it will definitely go top 10. I will say, like I said, 90%. Top 10 chances. Also, I would think it would probably have a chance in also going top 5 down the road. Um, I do think that the song will have some longevity. Um, I don't know how much longevity because again, the song is still kind of early on, and we still need to see what's going to happen once this week kind of fades off because this was a pretty popular week for the song. Again, as she performed it, so I do think that radio will do its job in getting it up there in terms of her being if the song in terms of the song being played a lot on pop radio. Um, but I think it's definitely going to go top 10. Probably, think this week on Monday's chart.
I agree with you. I do think it's going top 10. The one thing that I worry about is its on-demand streaming being cannibalized by Breathin', but so far that hasn't happened. We'll have to wait a couple of weeks to see what happens to the streaming, but it'll be interesting to see if those two songs can coexist in the upper echelon of both Spotify and Apple Music, because typically that's hard to do even for a rapper to have an established single and like a new single. I mean, think about. I mean, did Nonstop stick in the Spotify top 10 for long after "In My Feelings" went viral? No, it didn't. Did it do the same thing on Apple Music? I mean, yeah, it fell right out of the top 10. And I think you could see the same thing happen with "God Is a Woman" and "Breathin'." Now the question is, if that does happen, will it have enough radio to save it? And the answer is maybe, because there's a very real chance that it goes number one on pop. "No Tears Left to Cry" also went number one on pop. "God Is a Woman" seems like it has nothing in its way. It's been rising very steadily. The song has a lot of buzz outside of radio, and so I would totally expect it to go at least top 5, and I would be not surprised at all if it goes number one on pop radio. So even if its streaming does weaken because of Breathin', there's still a very real chance that it goes top 10 because of its pop radio support. And so I'm encouraged by its prospects because it has something to fall back on. It's not like there's no plan B here. The plan A is remain strong on-demand streaming, get a nice peak on pop radio, and go top 10. The plan B is if your streaming collapses, you still can have a great push at pop radio, go number one there, and probably still go top 10. So the reason why I'm so confident about this song going top 10 in the end is because it has that plan B in place. Whether that was intentional or not, that's just the way it's shaken out. So I would say that this song has at least a 70% chance of going top 10, if not, 80, 85. You never want to say 100 because, obviously always something can pop up. Lil Uzi Vert could surprise drop his album the week that it was going to go top 10 and have 3 songs debut in the top 10 and block it. So you never know what's going to happen, but I'll put it at 70, 80% because I'm really impressed by how this song has performed, honestly. It's shown more stability on-demand streaming than No Tears Left to Cry ever did. The streaming that No Tears Left to Cry achieved in its opening weeks was really because it was because of lead single hype. And it ended up, falling pretty steadily once we got 1.5, 2 months past its release. But God is a Woman has stayed very stable in on-demand streaming so far, over its first week or so. So it's really done well for itself, and I really see it going top 10 in the future.
Yeah, and honestly, this kind of takes me back to when 4 years ago when she released Break Free featuring Zed, and the song it didn't go top 10 in its first week. I think it went top 20 or somewhere near the top 20 in its first week, and it kind of just stayed afloat until the video was released, and it shot up to like I think the top 5 or something like that. So I guess we can kind of compare this chart run to we could compare God as a Woman, I guess, chart trajectory to Break Free in the sense that they're both second singles. They both didn't really take off until they had like some type of push. With Break Free being this video, and then with God as a Woman being the release week of the album Sweetener, and also her performing the song at the Video Music Awards. So, and then we know at the end, Break Free was a pretty big hit too. I mean, it was a really huge pop, rhythmic, and adult pop hit. So we know she had that going for her. And that was also kind of a hint that that era, the My Everything era, was going to be a pretty successful era for her. So again, going back to will it go top 10? Yes, definitely a high chance. But again, we never want to say it will 100% because things happen. We can have a surprise release or unfortunately someone could pass away or what have you. Something happens and then it doesn't happen. The chances of it going top 10 just decreases dramatically. So that's just kind of where it is right now. But yeah, it has a very high chance.
All right, so that wraps up Will It Go Top 10 for this week. Remember, if you have any songs that you want us to evaluate the chances of going top 10, just post them in the thread, tweet us at Charts Podcast on Twitter, and we will make sure to cover them in next podcast's Will It Go Top 10 segment. The next thing we want to talk about is a topic that was sent in by a listener, so thank you, you know who you are, and it's about Hot 100 records. Which ones are unbreakable? Which ones are likely to be broken in the future? And I picked out a couple of the Hot 100 records that I found most interesting. And we're going to talk about them and essentially say whether we think that the current industry climate is conducive to them being broken or to them staying put. And the first record I want to talk about is the longest climb to number one record. Now, the longest climb to number one for any song is held by Macarena, which took 33 weeks to climb to number one in 1995 and 1996. It actually went number one in 1996, started its chart run in 1995. 33 weeks is over half a year. It's 7 weeks more than half a year. And really the only climb that I can think of recently that was that long happened on radio, happened on pop radio. I remember when Alessia Cara climbed for over half a year on pop radio with Here and ended up going, top 5 or top 3. I can't remember if it went number one. And then you had this year the song I Like Me Better by Love. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his name, Lauv. That also took, over 250 days to peak on pop radio. But in terms of a climb all the way to number one and on the Hot 100, just on the radio chart, not just on the radio chart, but on the Hot 100, do you think that's possible in today's climate?
Well, considering Macarena took 33 weeks, and I think the second largest before that, I'm not sure exactly what it was. I think, well, the one that happened most recently was 30 weeks, and that was All of Me with John Legend back in 2014. And
yeah, 30 weeks.
That was 30 weeks, yeah. That happened because radio did not really align. It's like, because it was an urban AC hit, it was an urban hit, pop hit, adult pop, so it had a lot of radio airplay, but the radio airplay kind of did not sync up with all one another. So like you had urban AC, it becoming a hit there first, but then pop radio came along, rhythmic, and then everything else came after that. But it was such a strong hit in every metric that it kind of just had to wait at number two for a very long time because Happy, which was the biggest song of 2014, was ruling the charts all throughout the winter and the early spring of 2014. So it just kind of waited its turn before it had to go number one. And I think it went number one for about 3 weeks. But we can just imagine how much longer it would have gone number one had it not been for either Happy or Dark Horse, which was also logged in the top two for a very long time. So, but that again happened 4 years ago. And then I think this year Havana took over 20 weeks to go number one.
23 weeks, yeah.
Yeah, so again, we have that example, and that was about a 5 month climb to the number one spot. So we have these instances where it has happened, but they're not happening. They're not happening as frequently. Again, and the closest one that we've seen in recent memory was 30 weeks with All of Me. And then I think with the Macarena, if we revisit a little bit with Macarena, it started as an original song, which I think spent some time on the chart, and then it dropped off. But then the remix, which is what got the most popularity of the song, the song that we all know to this day, that's the song that kind of put it back on the charts and drove it back to number one. So you have to think about that time it spent off of the charts before dropping off and coming back to number one as well. So that kind of helped it get those, I guess, 33 weeks of quote unquote climbing to number one. But I don't think, honestly, it's going to be very hard for that record to be broken. I mean, it's been 22 years now because Macarena was actually the summer of 1996, and we are going into year 22 of the record pretty much still being intact. And honestly, it's going to be very hard for that to happen, or someone is going to come really, really close, like maybe within 25 to 30 weeks of climbing up to the top of the Hot 100, but they're going to, again, pretty much fall short, for various reasons, because you have songs that will start to decay when they're sitting, in the spot for a very long time, like in the number two or number three spot, and then once they reach a certain peak, sometimes they're going to pretty much lose steam in all departments. Like either radio's going to collapse, or either radio sales and streams are all going to collapse at the same time, and then you don't want that if you're trying to break a record. So honestly, I don't think it's going to happen, but I think someone's going to get really, really close to the record.
So I think this is an interesting record because despite the recent examples that you've cited, All of Me and Havana, I think this is actually a deceptively difficult record to break, especially the way that the climate is today, the way that the industry is set up today, the way that the chart is today. So I'll explain why right now. I think that in order to beat this record, what you need to do is essentially have radio build up slowly enough that you can have it peak really late in its chart run. So you need to have radio build slowly, and whether that's because it's crossing over from rhythmic to pop, or from alternative to pop, or from pop to rhythmic, usually a crossover helps. So with Havana, for example, you had it crossing over to rhythmic, and of course the Young Thug feature was what helped there a lot. And you had some, I think, a little bit of Latin airplay too when the Daddy Yankee remix came out. So Havana was crossing over to rhythmic and Latin, and All of Me was crossing over like from adult pop, from those corners, to more mainstream pop and rhythmic, and as you said, also getting urban AC airplay. So the first thing you need radio to peak really late, and usually that involves some sort of crossover. Sometimes it doesn't, but usually it does. And remember, these have to be number one hits, so typically they're not just going to be played on one format, because if you're only number one in one format, I doubt that you're going to go number one on the Hot 100. So probably some sort of crossover. So that's the first thing you need. The second thing that you need, and which is much, much harder to get today, is you need either a late peak in streaming, or you need streaming to hold for a really long time. So here's why that's difficult. Most of the massive hits that we see today that go number one start with their strongest streaming numbers. Their streaming peak comes early. And the reason that they stay number one for a long time is because either their streaming peak is so high that they can fall for a while and it's still okay. So that's like God's plan, In My Feelings. Started high, they've been falling steadily, but they started so high that even as they've fallen, they've remained comfortably at number one. Or you start high and you stay high. You debut with a high streaming number and you stay with a high streaming number for a long time. even if it's not stratospheric, if you have that consistency, then you stay number one for a long time. So, but here to break this record, you need to start at fairly low on streaming because you can't debut at number one because you have to have the longest climb to number one. So, in order for this record to be broken, I think it would have to be a song released by, not a very high profile artist. Because if you have a high profile artist, you risk going number one your debut week. Like any new Drake single, for example, has no chance to break this record because it's going to peak on streaming very early, and that sooner rather than later it's going to either go number one or start dropping. You need a song that's going to cross over on radio and like gain streams as it's crossing over, which is really tough. And I don't know. I think that any song to break this record would really be out of left field because I think the more mainstream artists, I think everybody realizes in the industry now that streaming is the most important aspect, and that's where you focus your efforts. And you focus really on having high streaming for the first couple of months of your chart run, and that's exactly what you can't have if you want to break this record. So that's why my theory is if you have a song that breaks this record, it's going to be a song that's out of left field that you wouldn't think is going to break the record. Probably not by a really huge artist. And not only that, it would probably be a song that in some way or another just manages to catch fire in a weird way with the public because you need something to boost that streaming from nothing to something. Because if it's a song that's not going to be released by a huge artist, the streaming has to be boosted somehow. And whether that's by some kind of meme, some kind of viral dance, that's certainly possible. Whether it's by some sort of, marketing campaign, whether the song's used in a commercial or something like that, a high-profile advertisement, that's certainly possible. But there would have to be some impetus to boost its streaming to the point where it would be able to go number one. With All of Me, you also had sales. The thing is that sales don't matter anymore. As you mentioned, sales are dead. So you can't rely on having more and more people discovering your song and buying it anymore because that doesn't matter. No one buys music anymore. So really, because we're back to a two-metric chart. We're back to a two-metric chart, radio and streaming. It used to be radio and sales. Now it's radio and streaming. And streaming matters a lot more than radio. So whereas before maybe you could have had that record broken by really relying on a long radio run, now you have to have the streaming too, and that's what I think makes this so difficult. I mean, I can't think of... I personally would bet against this record being broken over the next 5 years. I don't know about you, but I would certainly bet against it.
Yeah, you're absolutely everything you just said. I think you pretty much hit everything on the head. And I like the thing that you said. Like, if this record was to be broken, everything has to basically start from scratch. Like, everything would have to be, as we like to say on ATRL, organic. Like, you have to start low with radio, with streams and sales, and you can't have any of those peak too early, because when one peaks early, then it's going to crash and burn. You have to kind of have everything come up from the bottom to the top. And I agree with you. I don't think any high profile mainstream artist is going to be able to climb to number one because they're already going to be exposed a lot on radio, which is going to be one of their first peaks. Like a Drake single, you're not going to see, like you say, you're not going to see a Drake single climb to number one in 30 weeks. You're not going to see a Taylor Swift single climb to number one in 30 weeks. You're not going to see, I don't know, you're not going to see a Rihanna single climb to number one in 30 weeks because these artists are already known and they're being exposed. So I agree with all of that. There are instances in the past where, you did have huge artists who had hits that did take a long time to climb to number one, and this was actually back in 2007. Fergie, she had Big Girls Don't Cry, which actually ended up being the biggest hit from that album, and it was a fourth single. It was from her first album, The Duchess. It actually jumped to number 5 1 week, and then it kind of just stayed in the top 5 for about 3 or 4 months before actually going number 1. But see, back at that time, there were huge hits. There was Umbrella, there was Sean Kingston. These were like huge hits that were going on at the time. So, that was just a specific incident where I, kind of mentioned in the past where you those songs kind of just had to wait it out because, everything above it was just so huge, but then the song itself was also huge, so it couldn't really make any headway either up or down because the song was so huge. So you do have those instances as well, but if that's going to happen these days, again, like you mentioned, you know, things have to rise all together and not asymmetrically, because when you have that asymmetric balance, then you don't have that guarantee of staying afloat and moving your way up, basically at a snail's pace, and it kind of just hampers your chances of even doing so. So yeah, I agree with everything you said.
And to kind of put a bow on what I was saying, I didn't really break down in terms of, individual streaming services, but I think that, I guess, if you really wanted to break this record, one way that you could do it is release like the most buzzworthy music video ever, just when it was peaking on radio, and that peak on radio would have to be 25, 30 weeks in. But saving your video could be one way to kind of strategize to try and break that record, but doing that, you'd risk, having your song burn out on other services because of no buzz. If you want all the buzz to occur in the 30th week, you have to find some way to get to you have to find a way to get to that 30th week without losing all your buzz. And then you can have your big boost. But getting to that 30th week without losing all the buzz, that's the bigger challenge. And again, I think that would require some kind of outside influence that would keep it afloat for that long. But that's interesting. That's an interesting record to think about, and I think that we'll still see long runs like that on radio. I think that's very common because you have a song that initially radio programmers kind of sleep on. Maybe they see it, and then maybe a couple months later they see a couple call-out scores. The song's just been hanging around in the 50s or 60s, and it starts to rise, and it climbs slowly, and it climbs slowly, and eventually peaks in the top 10. That's exactly what happened with I Like Me Better. I think that will still continue to occur on radio. I just don't think that can occur on the Hot 100 given the nature of streaming the way that is today. But very interesting. So the next record we want to talk about is a record that's it's been much more threatened, and it actually was broken just last year. And that is the record for most weeks in the top 10. Now, this record is currently held by Shape of You, also with 33 weeks, coincidentally, the same number of weeks that Macarena took to go number one. Previously, it was held by, it was a tie between LeAnn Rimes' How Do I Live and the Chainsmokers' Closer. Closer tied that record when it back in early 2017, when it dropped out of the top 10 in February 2017 or March with 32 weeks. Uptown Funk spent 31 weeks in the top 10. So this is a record that's been repeatedly challenged recently. God's Plan actually just this year spent half a year inside the top 10. Perfect spent 27 weeks in the top 10. That's What I Like spent 28. So this record has been challenged a lot by recent hits, and of course that's because with streaming we get a better picture of longevity. With sales, we couldn't measure how often people were listening to songs after we bought them. With streaming, we can really track every listen, and so we can much more accurately measure longevity with streaming. And that's reflected in the fact that this record has been challenged over and over again. Do you think that that's going to stop? Do you think that there's eventually going to be, a song that breaks the record for good and then, it's not threatened again? Like, how vulnerable do you think this record still is to being broken?
I mean, the record has been tied, or it's been tied and pretty much broken in the last 2 years or so. So I think the record is pretty much, I guess, very vulnerable at this point. Shape of You has 33 weeks, as you mentioned, and I do think there will be another artist that can come along and do that. I mean, with I don't know how much of a longevity pattern we'll see with In My Feelings, but I do think that may have a chance. It's been in the top 10 for about, I guess, 10 weeks now, maybe 7 or 8 weeks or something like that, but it's still kind of early on, and the streams are not dying too quickly, so that may have a chance in either coming close to the record or maybe even tying the record. But I do think it's very vulnerable with the fact that streaming is now important and is being reflected more on the charts. I do think the record definitely has a chance of being broken, a few more times over and over. I mean, it took over almost 20 years for the records to be broken, but then we have seen these songs that have stayed longer in the top 10 due to streaming. We've seen we've seen these songs that have stayed longer on the chart overall due to streaming, and then this is why where we've seen the fact that Billboard has now implemented a new rule a couple years ago, whereas if your song has spent at least 25 weeks or more in or I'm sorry, at least 52 weeks or more in the top 25, then it will continue to chart. But as soon as it drops below 25, it's off the charts, and that's after a year. So they're trying to do as much as they can to push out songs that are being stagnant on charts, if you will. But I do think that has a lot to do with streaming. And you and I have talked about this before. I think the recurrent rule is very it has some holes in it because basically they're trying to suppress popularity, but I guess that's another topic for another day because we can talk about that all day. But I do think the record is definitely vulnerable and can be broken a few more times.
Yeah, and I think really to break the record, again, see, the thing with all the common theme with all of these records is that you really can't have just radio or just streaming. You need both. So the reason why Shape of You was able to break the record and not Drake, because obviously we know that Drake is a much stronger streaming artist than Ed Sheeran, but the reason that Shape of You could break the record and God's Plan didn't really come close is because Shape of You had remarkable longevity on radio, on pop, and then as it was declining on pop, of course, it started to rise on HAC, it started to rise on AC. It really had all formats going for it, and so its decline was kind of it was tempered by its simultaneous rise on AC and HAC, which helped it out. And plus, it just had great longevity there. I mean, radio still can't stop playing it. The same thing with Perfect. Ed Sheeran just seems to have the most amazing radio longevity. So even though Shape of You, like, by its fourth, fifth week, it was already a heavily radio-driven hit. And by its 20th, 30th week, it was really like almost 100% radio-driven. But it still managed to stay in the top 10 and break the record. So you can't just have streaming holding on for forever. You need radio too. And that's why someone like Drake, I don't think is actually likely to break that record. I think it would have to be someone that's strong in both radio and streaming. So you think of Ed Sheeran. You think of a guy like Bruno Mars who came close. I mean, I don't know if Bruno can do that again because I really am not high on his prospects for whenever he releases next. I think he's declining, but that's a topic for another day. But someone like that who has equivalent appeal, they don't necessarily have to be a big streaming artist. They just have to be someone whose big hits get streams, is what I'm saying. Like, not all artists are streaming artists, but some artists, they never get streams. Some artists, when they get really big hits, yeah, they pull the streams. And that's a guy like Ed Sheeran. I mean, when he doesn't get hits, the streaming isn't there. Like, Castle on the Hill, the streaming wasn't there at all. But Shape of You, the streaming was there. Perfect, the streaming got there. It was bad, and then it got there when the song got big. They did a lot of things to help it. The Beyonce remix helped. A lot of great playlisting. It got there. So there are some artists that have big singles. The streaming just gets there when they're big on radio. So it wouldn't be like a one-dimensional artist like anybody who only is strong on radio or strong on streaming. But I do think the record is still vulnerable. I'm not sure if we're going to see it threatened as frequently as we've seen it threatened over the last couple of years, simply because it's gotten so tough to break. 33 weeks is a long time. That's a really, really long time to be staying in any region of the chart and not move out of that region. I mean, has there ever been a song to stay 33 weeks in the 10 to 20 region or in the 20 to 30 region? I doubt it. So to have a song spend that long in the top 10 is really remarkable. It's like if you had a song that started in the top 10 in January, if it stayed in the top 10 for 33 weeks, then it would just be leaving the top 10 now, which is insane. That's an insane amount of time to be spending in the top 10. And I think that because radio is becoming more and more divorced from streaming, I think it becomes a little bit less likely that it gets broken, but I still think it has a higher chance to get broken than the record we talked about, which is the longest climb to number one. So, interesting thing to think about. I'm a little bit higher than the last record we talked about, but I'm still pretty unsure.
Yeah, I think I think I agree with you when you said that it won't be broken as frequently, and then you do need a lot of artist who has that strong edge in radio and streaming. And that's something that I should have thought about when I talked about Drake, because I know he's a very strong streaming artist, but not too much of an artist who gets a lot of recurrent airplay as Sharon, because he crosses over to many formats, and that kept him around for a long time. And the same thing with Closer as well. So again, that's going to be interesting to see if a any artist can do that with a stronghold in radio and streaming. Maybe Ed Sheeran's next single or next lead single can at least come close to the record. But I don't think he may have anything as big as Shape of You, because that song was just really an instant hitter with a lot of people. So I don't think that his next single will be as huge. But I've been proven wrong before. But I do think that radio and streaming is definitely important, as you mentioned.
All right, so we have to wrap up pretty soon. So we're going to cover some more interesting records and Hot 100 facts next episode. I think this is a great topic, so I'm really glad that it was suggested. So we'll definitely cover more next episode. But quickly before we sign off for the day, let's talk about what song it has the highest chance of being the next Hot 100 number one. Of course, In My Feelings is the current number one, has been for 7 weeks, but it's really declining quickly now on-demand streaming and YouTube. And so the window opens up for a new number one. Girls Like You is the current number two. You've also got Lucid Dreams, you've got Fifi, you've got Better Now hanging out. What song do you think has the best chance of going number one and replacing In My Feelings?
Um, I mean, based on current stats and based on how the chart is set up right now, I mean, "Girls Like You" is the song that is waiting behind "In My Feelings" at the moment. So you would think that that has the best chances of them all going to number one. It's been very, very stable in sales, and it continues to be one of the top sellers every week, and the streams are doing really well. I mean, not superb, but enough to keep its momentum going. And of course, it's one of the biggest airplay hits right now. I think it's also number one on overall radio, so it has that going forward. Um, but if it's gonna go number one, I think it should happen soon. And I was very surprised to see that the song did not get discounted as a lot of people had thought it would. Seeing it, it's pretty much at its maximum peak right now in terms of popularity. But see, now you have other songs that are creeping up the Hot 100, or other songs that could potentially become a threat, which could you know a song could leapfrog over Girls Like You and go to number one instead. So, you know, I I would say that has the strongest chance as of now. But you have other songs as well that could be contenders, such as possibly uh, Fifi, which was doing pretty well. Last time I checked, I mean, I haven't checked over in a week, but I know things have changed. I know Billboard had also mentioned a song that has a possibility, which was, I think they said Sicko Mode, which is still taking off and is still kind of in its infantry stages. It's kind of just starting off, but it still has a pretty huge start if you think about everything's considered. But I mean, the strongest chance at this moment would be Girls Like You, but I do fear that if the song is about to stall, then I think it's pretty much it at this point, because I don't think it's going to go too much further on radio. I think it's already at its maximum peak for radio. Um, so I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss, because I want to say Girls Like You, since it's right there at number two, but again, with these days, you really never know.
Well, one song that I definitely want to bring up is Lucid Dreams by Juice World, which has actually been around for a while now. First reached the top 10 back before summer started, I believe. But it's still hanging out, and it's really had remarkable stability on-demand streaming, particularly on Spotify, where it's still top 5. And actually on Apple Music too, where it's been top 10 pretty much since it blew up. And although it doesn't have the radio support that Girls Like You has, that Better Now has, that even Fifi has, I really think that it has a chance to be the next number one if it continues to just flatline on streaming, which is remarkable considering how high it is on streaming and how long it's been there in the first place. I did not expect it to still be around after, 3, 4 months in the top 10, but lo and behold, it's still there. And so I think that Girls Like You, Girls Like You has a chance, but like you said, they've kind of exhausted all their options with it. There's nothing they can do to really give it a boost in points. So if it goes number one, it's only going to go number one because it's falling slower than In My Feelings and nothing else is replacing it. So it would go number one, by proxy, just because it's not falling as fast. With a song like Lucid Dreams, it would be because, Lucid Dreams is staying remarkably stable on streaming and actually is continuing to gain a little bit on airplay. It's number 5 on Rhythmic Radio right now and number 11 on Urban, so it still has room to grow on both of those formats. Number 30 on Pop, where it's actually this is the part that surprised me. Lucid Dreams is number 30 on Pop, and it's growing fairly fast, a bullet of 741. So if it continues to rise on radio, it definitely has a chance to take that number one spot. Better Now, they still have a video that hasn't been released for Better Now yet, so Better Now has a chance to get a big boost from that. We'll see. Rockstar got a nice boost from its video. If you remember the controversy when they released a quote-unquote vertical, or no, not vertical, that was, vertical video was a different song, but for Rockstar, Republic Records put a 30-second loop of the chorus online on YouTube. People viewed that a bunch of times. That counted towards the YouTube points for Rockstar. So maybe Billboard didn't really like that in the end, but if Republic has another trick up their sleeve, you can't count out Better Now, especially because it hasn't had a video released yet. Fifi seems like its time has kind of passed, honestly. It felt like it was really quasi-viral for the first 2 weeks of release there, but now it feels like just a normal, pretty big hit. I doubt it will go number one, but it's going to stay in the top 10 for a little while. Going back to Girls Like You, though, I'm just so impressed by the fact that, and we actually talked about this, Maroon 5 just continues to effortlessly go number one on pop radio like it's nothing. Adam Levine is like in his 40s now. This is not a young act. This is not a fresh act. They release, people complain about it. They release the same thing over and over, and it goes number one every time on pop, and it goes top 5 every time on the Hot 100. Basically, it's amazing, the consistency. So if it does go number one, I think that would be really impressive. I don't think we should understate how impressive it would be if Girls Like You goes number one. Now, of course, to finish my thought, I'm not sure if the number one song, the next number one, is not released yet. Oftentimes, it's underestimated. Usually, when people think about what's going to be the next number one on the Hot 100, they're only considering songs that are currently on the Hot 100, and that's often a mistake. Oftentimes, the next number one has not been released yet, as we saw most famously in the case of Uptown Funk. Everybody thought it was going to break Mariah Carey's record, and then See You Again came along and snatched the number one spot from it just like that. The lesson was essentially that you have to account for external releases that haven't been put out yet as well. So I think that you have to acknowledge that, but I actually think the possibility of that is lower here, because like I said, most of the high-profile artists in the streaming world have already released this year, and I doubt they're just going to put out random high-profile singles in late August, early September. So I think it is most likely the next number one is either Lucid Dreams or Better Now, assuming that In My Feelings continues to drop as steadily as it is on streaming right now.
Yeah, I completely forgot about Better Now. Not because I forgot about it on purpose, but I just forgot to account for the fact that it is high on radio and it's doing well on streaming. But the only thing it's missing is a video, which is kind of limiting its chances to go number one. And I remember when last two singles he's released, I mean, Rockstar was already a number one hit before the video, but then he released it well into his number one run, and the streams, kind of stayed afloat, which I, didn't think that would happen. And then with Psycho, he released a video about maybe the 13th or 14th week while the song was on the charts, and then this song ended up going number one. So it kind of what makes you wonder if he does the same thing for Better Now. If he releases a video, will it go number one? And statistics say yes. I mean, history says yes. So I mean, he does have a kind of a path, paved out for him if he does release the video to go number one. And then there's also talk about there's a mention that Rihanna may be releasing a song within the next month or so. And her last lead single, Work, took about 3 or 4 weeks to go number one after being released. So, and for the record, I think all but excuse me, all but one of her lead singles have gone number one. Her first lead single peaked at number two, but that was right behind Mariah Carey's "We Belong Together." Then also Russian Roulette, which also didn't go number one, which peaked at number nine. But she also has a good track record for going number one with her lead singles. But again, we're in the age where streaming has grown tremendously since 2016. But she is a streaming artist. She does well with her songs. It's just interesting to see if she's going to do well on the on-demand side of things, and see if that'll help her to success, to carry over her success from her previous eras and to get a number one this era. So, I wouldn't rule Rihanna out completely. I just honestly forgot to mention her because I think a lot of people were talking about her on various threads. But she could be a possibility as well, depending on when she releases and what the timing is of her release.
All right, well, that just about wraps up what we have time to talk about for today. There are a couple topics that, as we alluded to, we'll continue talking about on future podcasts. Hopefully, we'll have a lot more time next week because there won't be any high-profile feuds or crazy album release battles. At least I hope not, so we have time to discuss some other things. But for now, we're going to sign off. Remember, if you have any questions for us, we are always happy to take questions. We'll answer any and all questions you have relating to the music industry. Make sure to either tweet us on Twitter @ChartsPodcast or post your questions in the thread, which will be bumped as soon as this podcast is posted, the ATRL Charts Podcast thread in the charts section. Make sure to send in your questions. We love having a more interactive show instead of just us talking about whatever the hell we want to talk about. We want to talk about what you want us to talk about. So make sure to send in your questions. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for listening. Bye, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.